Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
And today we're going to do another Dissecting Fiction gaming episode about the Doom series.
The rather infamous Doom series now.
Yeah, infamous and influential, I think. That'd be a good little tagline. But, let's just hit the ground running on this. id Software, coming off of the success of the Wolfenstein games and Commander Keen, in 1992 is really looking for the next evolution of the first-person shooter, which still at that point is a pretty nascent genre. Initially, they get into legitimate talks with Fox to do an Aliens game. They're not failing at that. They're not getting a lot of pushback, but they kind of decide that they don't really want to do something where they're so constrained. And so they go back to the drawing board. They end up combining a couple of ideas. One of the biggest influences, not shockingly if you see some of the designs, is Dungeons and Dragons. And also they combine this with a pitch from before Wolfenstein for a game called tentatively Green and Pissed, which was just based off of some concept art that was done. They end up wanting to use demons heavily in the game, and that's kind of how we get to Doom.
I mean, it's you saying that it was based off of Aliens kind of explains quite a lot about this game, and even like the demon designs being D&D based, it all comes together pretty smoothly from there.
Yeah, no, it does make a lot of sense. Like level design, obviously, the general concept of Space Marines and the corporation running the bases, the UAC, bleeds aliens, and there are like the Kako demon pretty much looks like the Beholder.
Yeah,
it's right there, and it's early enough in video games where like I feel like they got away with it pretty easily. So the team that begins working on this are John Carmack, John Romero, Adrian Carmack, Kevin Cloud, and designer Tom Hall. Hall is tasked with really developing a lot of the story initially. He creates a very complicated narrative, not dissimilar from a D&D campaign. This is where there's a huge decision made in the company, though. The team, especially John Romero, apparently, start to pull away from the concept as written and start focusing more on how they can create a game that's more intriguing, more complicated than really anything that's been done at the time. Hall is on the verge of being fired. Romero petitions for him not to be, but it eventually ends up happening, and they really throw out the complex plot of Doom in favor of the basics, essentially being Space Marine ends up on the moons of Mars after there's an incident where they're starting to use interdimensional portal technology. Things start coming through the portal, wipe out the Marines team and pretty much everyone in the area, and as you go through the game, you slowly discover that it is an access port to hell. I think that simplification ultimately helps the game. We're going to talk more about the story going forward, but Doom probably, I would say, top 5 most influential games of all time.
Yeah, it's up there with like Super Mario Brothers. Like really, like this is where most every single first-person shooter comes from. And I mean, of course, now there's a variety of them, but like they're all rooted in Doom and what Doom did.
Yeah, Doom, the level design is very like puzzle based, which I think is something that is largely lost in the genre now. We'll talk about that as we go through the Doom games too. But what Doom did at that point, really better than anything else, was fast, action-driven scenarios that, there's very little letdown throughout the entirety of the first Doom game. Like, you're kind of hammering through from the first level. What I think is actually cool to note is that Romero made the first level last and set that as the opener because the first level was designed to show you essentially what the entire game was about and all of the new innovations they had really developed. That's something that's super notable because I can tell you out of all the Doom I played as a kid, that first level still sticks in my head as sort of the definitive image of Doom.
It's hard to not like be influenced by it immediately. It's just like the very aesthetics of it just kind of jump at you, even though it's mostly like Dark Corridors and things like that. The way I think they kind of did the art direction on it and everything is what lended the first level like such a memorable feel.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's, early enough in the genre where anything they do is going to be pretty unique, but the fact that it still stands out is a testament to the work done on that game. Doom itself is released on December 10th, 1993, and is distributed widely through something that our younger listeners may not be aware of, a shareware disc.
I was a bit after this. I grew up in kind of the AOL internet, but I'm sure Vinny's a lot more familiar with it than I am.
Yeah, I mean, I to be honest, my family didn't have computer until a little later than this, but I would go to my friends' houses, and essentially, shareware would allow you to install a game, and then you could pay for the game and enter a key and open up the entire game. This led to Doom being widely installed on PCs, even for people who weren't paying for it. So a lot of people like played that first level like a million times. And I think there's also like time signatures on some of those installs, and like people always figured out ways to get around them. Where like, oh, you could play for like a month, but then you got to pay, and then like no one did. And if you weren't going to pay, you weren't going to pay. But this leads to, like I said, this massive like install base for Doom, and it's estimated in 1995 that Doom was the most installed computer program on the planet.
Really? That doesn't surprise me because like I've even heard stories about like people putting Doom onto like toasters and calculators and things like that just because of like how intuitive and simple like the game is to like program around.
Yeah, it's like if anyone goes back and plays Doom, it's still very available. Any of your modern systems, you can download Doom on it, and you'll see that it's very simple layout for controls, but effective. And like we were saying before, it never really lets down on the fun. Doom's story itself, outside of sort of the brief recap we gave before, ends with a character who becomes known as the Doom Guy during Doom 1, defeating the armies of hell and heading back to Earth where an invasion has already started. This is actually where Doom's narrative gets stupid complicated, is like starting right at this point. It sounds like the most blatant, stupid story you could possibly write, but what they end up doing with it going forward gets very, very complicated and like pretty quickly. We made the decision here that we're going to go through not chronologically. Well, actually, we are going through chronologically with like our timeline in the world we exist, but we're not going to go chronologically in the Doom timeline when we tell the story, just to emphasize how complicated it gets.
Yeah, it'd be incredibly stupid to try to like figure out this timeline because it is full of reboots, soft reboots, just like alternate timelines, things like that. It's kind of impossible to untangle. But all you really need to know is that there's demons and you're the guy that needs to kill them.
Yeah, and going forward, it does get maybe a little more well crafted, but we'll get to that. It's going to take a little while to get there. Doom's this massive success. Doom 2 Hell on Earth is released on October 10th, 1994. I tried to find information on its development. Obviously, that's a very quick development cycle. Largely, Doom 2 is a lot of technical improvements and a lot of additions of new demons to fight. Doom 2 probably is the best of the original Doom games. It has that nice balance where they're not having to go too far off of where they started, but they get to make all those changes they probably wanted to in the original one and didn't get to do. And they also, the entire team has like a better understanding of what they're working with.
Yeah, this still has the original Doom team on it, correct? Like John Carmack and John Romero.
Yeah, your big players. As I said, Hall had been fired, released, however you want to see it, prior to this, but it is largely the same team. As we were saying, Doom 2, the plot is the opening of these gates has led the demons to Earth. By the time the Doom guy, not yet the Doom Slayer, but we'll call him the Doom guy, gets to Earth, much of the planet has been already wiped out. And he works in like a series of different missions. Initially, he's just trying to get the remaining humans off the planet. He then sort of realizes that he might be able to just go back into hell and wipe out the demons again and kind of end this once and for all. He does, essentially. As you're saying, not the most complex plot, more about the action in the game. But Doom 2, we end with the Doom guy triumphant over hell once again, defeating now the icon of sin, who's supposed to be Baphomet, but is also just kind of representative of all versions of Satan.
Yeah, like, again, this game kind of plays with a lot of, like, kind of vague ideas. None of it's really concrete until later on. Yeah, you're not supposed to be like, oh, this is literally Lucifer. It's kind of like a proxy for Lucifer. Best way to explain it.
Yeah, and in the first game, the villains end up more like monstery. You get the cyber demon, you get the spider mastermind, and they're really just, targets to shoot at. Here, they're trying to like more establish the sort of demonic overtones of everything. I mean, it's there in the first game, but I'd say in 2 is where it gets the satanic imagery kind of increases. The soundtrack starts to change and gets a little like creepier as opposed to this sort of like driving synthesized metal.
Yeah, it takes a bit more of a horror turn, which is something that the series is going to kind of have to reconcile with later down the line.
Following Doom 2, which is also a big success, on April 30th, 1995, a version of Doom called the Ultimate Doom is released. This is where these complications really kick in. The final campaign of Ultimate Doom is called Thy Flesh Consumed. And it essentially establishes that at the end of Doom, the Doom guy did not actually get out of hell right away. He was tricked and was stuck in hell longer before he got back to Earth. There's a couple of like contradictions in the timing of this and how things are explained between the original end of Doom and the beginning of Doom 2. So it kind of fits, and it's obvious that they were trying to make it fit, but it's sort of your first break off into this like possible like alternate version of Doom 2. Following Ultimate Doom in 1996, which is proving that it was not Ultimate Doom, Final Doom comes out on June 17th. Final Doom is actually an expansion for Doom 2. It adds 2 new little parts to the story that do fit a little bit better. It's called TNT Evolution and the Plutonia Experiment are the name of the 2 chapters. Essentially, this is a story that takes place after the successful defense of Earth. There are now more gates being opened up on Jupiter's moons because the UAC, in their infinite wisdom, thinks that putting it further away from Earth is going to stop everything, and the Doom guy has to go in and stop that. Once again, very similar construction where he starts out on the bases and then moves his way into hell. I would say what can be considered sort of the final full game in the original Doom series is Doom 64 that comes out on March 31st, 1997. A lot of the original team who had let other developers play around with the expansions comes back for Doom 64. A lot of people consider it to be like the real Doom 3. Once again, the Doom guy has already conquered, all of these demons. UAC once again reopens the portal, and there's actually a very specific reference to the fact that the Doom guy is basically doing the same thing over and over again because these idiots keep opening these portals. Doom 64 was really popular when it came out. I can tell you that from having played it. The end of Doom 64 is really important going forward, but not immediately. The end of Doom 64, the Doom guy kills the Mother Demon. The Mother Demon is supposed to be essentially like a queen bee that's generating all these other monsters. the Doom guy at the end of 64 is basically like, okay, this is going to keep happening. So instead of me constantly going back and forth and not being able to really have a life anyway, I'm going to remain in hell and just fight demons forever to keep this from happening. And that's
Yeah,
really where Doom 64 ends. And in a lot of ways, like that, for many, many years, that was sort of the end of the original Doom story.
it's a pretty metal way to end everything, that he just stays in hell forever killing demons.
Yeah, no, it's a really great ending, especially if you know like the next thing you're gonna do is gonna be, a different direction from this. But it also sets up something later, but much, much later. So Doom gets a bit of a rest for a while. Not really. Like Doom was still really prevalent. People were still playing it quite a bit. It obviously keeps going with all different franchises, and they begin to kind of rotate their big ones. And in between this, they also have created Quake, which, while I don't think is as big as it once was, still has a terrifically devoted fan base.
Quake, much like Doom, kind of invented a new genre of shooting. Quake is kind of infamous for creating the battle arena shooter, which is what Overwatch and Team Fortress 2 are largely based on, is that kind of genre game. Even like CSGO takes a lot of influence from that game, but Quake was a lot more about movement than how Doom was. Like Quake introduced launch pads. It was a lot about physics and everything.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of that Quake influence is going to be more obvious going forward too. However, as I was saying, like Doom at this point, ending the 90s is still very, very popular, very relevant to a lot of the players, and they get a movie deal with Universal Studios to
Uh-oh.
produce a Doom film. This expedites progress on a new Doom game, Doom 3. Now, as I said, Doom 64 by a lot of people is considered to be like the real Doom 3. Doom 3 is basically a remake of Doom, but it takes what had happened in the last few years, Doom 3 coming out on August 3rd of 2004, in the genre, and kind of, instead of innovating, Doom 3 kind of goes in and does a really good job of making the type of first-person shooter that showed up in the wake of Doom.
Yeah, it's if anything, it's a reimagining. I guess kind of the best way to explain it. It takes a lot of influence from horror more than any of the other Doom games. Doom 3 gets criticized a lot for being dark, like literally dark. It's hard to see in that game,
Yeah, it
and
is.
so it's kind of like, yeah, that's why it's not really seen as the Doom 3, but a Doom 3.
Yeah, Doom 3, don't get me wrong, like Doom 3 also a very big success for id. Doom 3 really goes almost the opposite way with the gameplay from the originals. Like Doom 3 is very slow and you got to kind of sneak around and you have to be very careful about how you confront the demons, which in one way I guess is more realistic, that, if you're one guy and you're not supposed to be anything special, that you would really be in a horrifying situation as opposed to this sort of like teenager drinking too many Mountain Dews with a shotgun like mode. Like it's a very different game. It was great and a lot of people liked it, but it doesn't quite feel like Doom, which is that immediate criticism. Doom 3 gets a bunch of expansions, and every expansion that comes out kind of pushes it more back towards the original Doom, but it never really gets there.
No, I think in this kind of time period, a lot of games were trying to be as cinematic and graphically complex as possible, and I think Doom 3 kind of fell to that. Halo and other games like that would kind of go back more to the Doom roots and kind of like take influential games like Quake as well. But Doom 3, I think, was trying to like forge something kind of completely different going ahead.
Yeah, Doom 3 to me always played like a first person shooter Resident Evil. That's how I felt when I played it. You had to use the flashlight a lot. Like it was fun, and in its time it looked great, and I think even today it's so solidly made that it does hold up. Like you can play Doom 3 and it doesn't look terrible. I think that's true with pretty much all of the Dooms they are what they are, but they're so well designed that they hold up.
Right, like none of them are bad at all. It's just like different tastes that you have. I think that's what each Doom kind of appeals to.
Maybe that's part of the strength of the series too, is there is a lot of variation. Doom RPG launches on mobile platforms in September of 2005. What's kind of cool about Doom RPG is it takes the plot of the original Doom and starts to bring it back to that original like D&D type concept.
So I don't think I ever played Doom RPG. So is it like literally like a D&D game?
It plays like kind of turn. It's hard to describe. I would encourage people to like look up videos on YouTube of it. It's essentially taking the original Doom visually and then turning it into, like I don't want to go point and click. That's not really accurate. But that kind of methodical RPG where you're picking a lot of text out.
Yeah, I know, like an action RPG.
Yeah, it's something closer to that. And it does start to flesh out the story of Doom 1 a little bit, but it's largely considered non-canon, just because about as much story as you need is explained in the original Doom. Doom RPG comes out right before the Doom film starring Karl Urban and The Rock. Comes out in October 2005. There's definitely this weird cross-influence of that film of Doom 3 kind of over the original Dooms.
You mean like in the movie?
Yeah, it definitely feels more like the aesthetic of Doom 3, I would say.
Like I said with Doom 3, I think it was trying to be more cinematic, and part of that was kind of creating these like dark and complex environments. All I really remember of the Doom movie is that one scene where it's like a first-person shooter for a little bit, and it lasts maybe like 2 minutes, and then The Rock was in it. But it was a lot darker visually too than I think anybody expected a Doom game to be.
They also get rid of the demonic element in the Doom movie, which I think is one of the reasons it doesn't really work. I would guess, and I should have researched this, and maybe on an addendum episode that we might do, I might address it more directly. I would assume the reason the demonic stuff was removed because some regions don't allow for films to be released that have a lot of occult elements.
Like China.
Yeah, I know there are other countries in Southeast Asia that also have similar policy where if you veer into the occult, you can't get as wide a release. But if you just say that they're made by people, it's fine.
Yeah, there were like mutants in this, right?
Yeah, they're supposed to be like genetically altered to what they find on Mars. Like, so they're like using like Martian DNA and it all goes wrong. Like, they're more like abominations of science.
Because
And then they throw in like a couple of names of characters are names of types of monsters. It's really one of those just like, why did you even bother if this was the script you were going to use? It's
yeah,
thankfully that's become less of a problem in like the last 20 years of, but it's one of those scripts.
wait, this the Doom movie kind of came out of that weird era where everybody was trying to make a movie of video games for some reason, like the Tomb Raider movies and everything.
You know, at least the Tomb Raider movies, like, not only did well, but they were close enough, right?
Yeah, that made sense.
Yeah. So the Doom film does not do especially well. I mean, I own on Blu-ray, but that's because I bought a Rock box set. But the Doom RPG, as far as mobile in that era, is doing pretty well. They do a Doom 2 RPG. Comes out November 2009. Once again, very similar to the Doom RPG, where they're really taking the basis of the game Doom 2 and then turning it into an RPG. One of the cool things in the Doom 2 RPG is they really start tightening this sort of id continuity that they toy around with. And you find out that the Doom guy is likely a descendant of Wolfenstein's BJ Blazkowicz, which is cool because if you played any of the Wolfenstein games, Wolfenstein also kind of a similar thing where they started in one place and started to toy with the genre as they moved forward and have always been pretty successful. But tying them together is a nice touch. And I know that the Doom guy also has shown up in some Quake material as well.
Oh, has he? I did not know that part.
Yeah, I believe he's in Quake Legends. I've never been a Quake guy, I'm not going to lie. So that was November 2009. In May of 2010, and like I said, this just never stops getting more complicated. There's another expansion for Doom 2. That expansion is called No Rest for the Living. It would take place time-wise in between Doom 2 and the expansions from Final Doom. So this is you seeing the Doom guy wiping out what's left of the demonic forces on Earth after he's defeated the forces in Hell.
So is this technically? Well, I guess we shouldn't get too much in the timeline here because we're going to be here all day. But would this fit into like the Doom trilogy, like the 264, or is this like something else entirely?
That's the intention. Is it's just sort of another thing that happened. This would be specifically in between Doom 2 and Final Doom.
Okay.
Around 2008, jumping back a tiny bit, Doom 4 was announced. It kind of disappears, and general consensus is that it was like a nightmare internally. It was kind of trapped in development hell. One of the few things that has come out that's pretty solid is at least at one stage, id CEO Todd Hollinshead confirmed that it was going to essentially be a remake of Doom 2, kind of following Doom 3's lead, where Doom 3 was sort of a remake of Doom 1. Doom 4 would have been a remake of Doom 2 based around squad-based gameplay and being somewhat similar to the really popular Call of Duty type titles at that point. I don't know how long that version lasted or how far that went through. Even by 2011, they've already sort of restarted production a few times on Doom 4. I think the coolest thing about that is they were apparently going to use some of the original scrapped stuff for Doom to influence the squad, because the original version of Doom that got scrapped, the Hall version of Doom, if you will, had multiple protagonists that were all supposed to be part of the same squad. And apparently they were going to kind of like bring that back to the story in this Doom 4 that never happened.
Interesting. It does sound like they're taking more and more cues from like Call of Duty and Halo, which were both kind of known for couch co-op at that time.
Yeah, and I think, they were trying to capture that market. It never really goes away, even when they're not making Doom games. As we were saying, they have multiple franchises. One of the big pushes they made around then was for Rage as well, would have only been, Rage is 2010? So this is around the same time. And Rage is another game where it's like incredibly solid, but the story's really light as far as actually being developed. And I mean, Rage at the time got really heavily criticized for being super short.
Well, also Rage flopped incredibly a lot for its budget. It was kind of one of the first bigger blockbuster bombs of the time. It's funny that it also came from id when they made other games like Daikatana and things like that. It's kind of known for having a bunch of flops and successes on their hands.
Yeah, and it's always interesting because it is. I would compare them, and this is going to be like a bizarre thing to say, but we've kind of covered this before. They kind of remind me of Disney, where even their flops aren't terrible pieces of work. They just don't work for whatever reason. And, maybe in a few years they get more appreciated. Once again, Rage, as bad as it flops, is a fairly solid game. It's just, it is too short, and that's it wasn't satisfying. But before we do an entire show on Rage, I haven't played Rage 2 yet, so I can't talk. We are still moving through a new Doom's development. I think it is around 2011 that they officially drop the Doom 4 moniker and go back to just calling it Doom. But the game that's being developed does not come out until May 13th of 2016. Called Doom. If you're looking online, type in Doom 2016. It's just going to get too confusing.
Yeah, that's what it's even called in the Steam store and everything. At this point, it's also kind of notable to say that id Software had been bought out by ZeniMax, which is the overarching company that also owns Bethesda. when Doom came out, this is kind of seen as id Software putting itself back on the map after kind of a messy buyout and a messy decade of just like kind of missing the mark with their games.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Doom 2016 was a big deal on multiple levels. One of the first things Doom 2016 does too is, well, we told you about the end of Doom 64, where the last we saw of the Doom guy, the original Doom guy, was that he was stuck in hell. Though the timelines get messy, and this is something that maybe is getting addressed as we get into Doom Eternal, it's fairly clear that the character now known as the Doom Slayer is supposed to be this Doom guy from Doom 64. The game really opens with him being pulled out of hell in like some kind of enchanted coffin that the demons have trapped him in finally. It's supposed to take place after there have been multiple incidents. The UAC is now sort of being torn between two leaders, Olivia Pierce, who's the leader of a group of Satanists, and Samuel Hayden, who's the real leader of the UAC, but is also obsessed with the argent energy that hell produces and is trying to access it.
This plot is so ridiculous sometimes. I love it.
The good thing is, though, when you play Doom 2016, there are two things that, to me, brought everything back up to par finally. First of all, it goes back to that rapid-fire combat using the new technology in really logical ways. Like, for instance, there are enemies called imps that shoot fireballs at you. They've existed since Doom 1. In this, imps start, like, jumping up on the walls, and they can, like, jump over you, and they're really frustrating in a way that they never were before. Does it play a little more like a typical shooter does today? Yes, but it's certainly more action-oriented, and I think its success really saved the series and affirmed that, you know, people don't necessarily want Call of Duty all the time.
Yeah, I remember when this game came out, I remember it was praised for like being so fast because like at this point you kind of had the Space Marine genre, quote unquote, where, you know, you had your Halos, you had your Call of Duties, and they were all very like, I don't want to say they were a bit sluggish in that they're a lot about kind of exploiting the environment and kind of using cover. Well, the Doom games were never really too much about cover. It was more about dodging projectiles. And Doom 2016 is the one that kind of brings that back where they say, like, you have this whole arena full of demons, kill the demons. And you have to do that, and you have to rely on your resources and being able to manage your inventory and everything in order to properly do it.
Yeah, and the inventory management starting in Doom 2016 gets really cool because they give you functions of different weapons where there's a type of kill called a glory kill where if you stun your villain, you can run up to them and like basically rip their head off or rip their spine out, something to that effect, and you get health. And there's also a chainsaw that you have to keep fueled, and when you use that, you can get ammunition, which in the later fights you have to start thinking about, okay, I have to glory kill this guy so I can not get killed here. Oh, I have to chainsaw this guy so I have more ammo. It really becomes a really cool element to the play, and it makes those levels where you are basically just surrounded by demons more interesting than you would expect them to be.
I guess to like quickly compare the two is like in Halo you had the regenerating health, and Doom you don't have that. And I think that single element of changing that from regenerating health to like picking up health packs, that's what makes Doom special. In that, especially Doom 2016, because it's incredibly violent and awesome and metal, and you have that kind of like heavy metal, thrash metal thing going on too, and it just makes it so like feel dire. You constantly have to be on the move. You constantly have to find like new ammo, health, and everything. You can't just sit still.
Yeah, it's a really cool game, and it also immediately acknowledges again what's acknowledged in Doom 64 is that this guy is kind of trapped in the same situations over and over and over again. Doom 2016 is not a remake of Doom. As I said, they make it pretty clear that this is supposed to be the same character, but you're kind of going through the same areas. Like this is taking place on Mars and you go into hell, and it's more of a parallel to the original Doom than anything else.
But we all know the Doom guy loves being in hell.
I mean, he stayed there. He
Yeah.
wanted to be there.
And you see how he punched those buttons and everything? He loves it. He's fine.
Just to keep this story moving, we'll go through some of the basic plot points of Doom 2016. We talked about Hayden and Pierce's rivalry. Essentially, it ends up breaking down to the Doomslayer's pretty much able to stop Pierce. He gets a what is it called? A crucible. There you go. Which it doesn't make any sense to me because isn't a crucible like a pot? This crucible is a sword. So he obtains this crucible, which is going to control the Argent energy. Hayden betrays him and takes it, and that's the end of the game. Which, if I have any complaints about Doom 2016, it's that. All the other Dooms, even when you knew that he, like, at the end of Doom that you were going to go to Earth, it felt more like the end of the movie. This one kind of felt like, oh, all right, we didn't even get through the whole story. But the game is long enough. It's fun all the way through. You get to fight the Cyber Demon and the Spider Mastermind again, and this time it's like insane. Like the Cyber Demon is like one of the most fun, frustrating things I've ever played. But it does end letting you know that, okay, this story isn't over.
Well, any game ends when you defeat the cyber demons. It's, how do you top that?
We get to the end of Doom 2016, and you're all thinking right now, like, oh, cool, we're going to talk a little about Doom Eternal and like where the series is going. But no, because id Software will not let it be that simple. In December of 2018, Sigil is released. Sigil is the sequel to Thy Flesh Consumed. It's an expansion for Doom 1.
Oh.
Essentially, Sigil establishes that even at the end of Thy Flesh Consumed, you did not actually get to go straight into Doom 2. You went deeper into hell, and things get even creepier. Sigil's actually super cool. If you're a big Doom fan, it looks, as we were saying, like Doom 2 went a little more satanic looking. Sigil is by far the most like 90s black metal looking thing I've ever seen. It's essentially just another expansion of Doom. A lot of the same enemies pop up again, but it is challenging. Like I said, it does have its own aesthetic. Supposedly, this is supposed to clean up the transition from Thy Flesh Consumed into 2. I think it makes it more complicated, but at this point, who cares? You almost have this alternate Doom 2 where he just gets stuck in hell anyway.
Well, it's if you get stuck in hell multiple times, you get good at it eventually.
It's funny you say that, because as Doom 2016 grew in popularity and people were realizing this connection between Doom 64 and Doom 2016, it is announced that Doom 64 is going to be released on modern systems. It ends up getting delayed, and part of the reason it ends up getting delayed is because they add a set of levels called the Lost Levels, which even more closely tie the end of Doom 64 to the beginning of Doom 2016. It's essentially the same ending, but I think it's starting to set up this idea that the Doom Slayer is the Doom Slayer for a reason, and there's something else going on behind the scenes.
At this point, like the Doom Slayer's never named, right? He doesn't have like a name.
No, I think, not getting too far into Eternal, we're going to talk a little bit about it and kind of how, all this built to it. To my knowledge, the only time that there's any specific reference to his name is in that Doom 2 RPG.
Interesting, because I am just kind of interested in how they build this entire like big story for a guy for essentially that has no name and it's just like supposed to be the player avatar.
Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit with Doom Eternal. We're going to avoid spoilers on Eternal for this episode. As I mentioned before, we might do an addendum to this, and if we're going to do it, we're going to see how you guys react to this episode. If you like it, we'll do one on Doom Eternal specifically, and then we'll be super spoilery. But I will talk about Doom Eternal a little bit. Doom Eternal came out March 20th of 2020, the same day as Animal Crossing New Horizons, which, if you have not seen those YouTube videos, please seek out some of that. They're pretty great. Doom Eternal picks up 8 months after the events of the 2016 Doom. Once again, we have a parallel to what's happened before. Earth has been invaded, but things are a little different. We find out that this is essentially the work of the Satanists that were infiltrating the UAC. Hayden went back to stop it and was somewhat successful for a while, building these giant robots to fight demons, which is a really cool element that gets added in, but ultimately fails. By the time the Doomslayer gets to Earth, for some reason he has a giant castle spaceship.
I mean, why not?
When you see it, you're like, oh yeah, totally, I don't care where this came from. And it's playing off of something that was started in Doom 2016, where you get these hints that there's like something up with the Doomslayer, that he's not just a soldier who's really effective at killing these demons. You learn in Doom 2016 also that the Doomslayer is the only person to ever go into hell and come out alive. Hayden, who is a cyborg, or I guess he's just a straight up robot by the time we get to him, has also done it, but he doesn't really qualify as human. So something is going on with the Doomslayer. You immediately start to learn more as you play Doom Eternal about his history. And there is something that pops up that explains one of the inconsistencies between Doom 64 and Doom 2016, but I'm not going to tell you about that. I'm just going to encourage you to play the game to find that out for now. Like I said, we might come back to this if this episode is well received. But Christiaan, I think this would be the appropriate time to kind of talk a little bit about Doom's impact on video games in general.
Even the names like John Carmack and John Romero have kind of echoed throughout the video game industry in the same way Hideo Kojima has. And it is, like many have said, the kind of source of all first-person shooters, for better and for worse in many ways.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, it's something that I felt a little directly as a kid. Doom was also one of the games that broke the conception that video games were for children. You really have that sort of rapid-fire couple of years where you get Wolfenstein, you get Mortal Kombat. You have that tail end of that first gen where developers like Kojima are starting to get a little more serious. Doom was one of the ones that pushed it over, where you saw college kids, playing PC games and figuring out how to create LAN networks so they could play together. And I think in multiple ways, it was a unifying game amongst adult gamers.
The game was also heavily criticized for how violent it was, which seems kind of quaint now when you have like developers literally getting PTSD working on these games for how violent they are now. But back then it was kind of considered like a brainwashing Satanist tool. And I think Doom being able to put all these demons, like kind of real-life demons too, and all these guns and everything, was able to kind of push this idea like, you're right, the games aren't just like Mario or Sonic or anything like that. They can be a bit more bloody and complex.
Yeah, the violence thing is worth talking about a little bit too. It was one of the games that every time anything came up about violence in video games, Doom was always referenced, which in some ways, as you're saying, seems a little ridiculous now, especially considering that Doom is essentially a game where you're never killing like a human, like a regular human. There's like monster guys running around. But I remember after Columbine how much they harped on the fact that the killers had played Doom. And it's like, well, everyone in that generation played Doom. Like it's an interesting cultural touchstone on like a bunch of levels. Very similar to Mortal Kombat. The same way that it survived because the games were always of a decent quality. And the fans, overwhelmingly were not disturbed by it.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I also think like the success of Doom is simplicity too. You can kind of quickly pick it up and play it without too many distractions. And the gameplay of it was just simple to understand. You shoot the big red demon man and you get the keys for the door. And I think that's also what allowed it to have such broad appeal, is that you can kind of give it to anyone and anyone will very quickly understand it.
And as I was saying too, like that shareware element, like you literally could give it to anyone.
Yeah.
And even if you're playing that first level over and over again, that first level was well designed enough to keep you entertained. Something that a lot of games could learn from these days. I'm gonna take a shot at something here. Huge fan of Rockstar. I don't think there's been a game that they've put out in the last 20 years that I haven't played for some period of time. But if you were to try to start someone in video games on Red Dead Redemption 2, they'd quit within that first 3-hour intro.
Yeah, Rockstar games are incredibly slow to start out with. Even like Grand Theft Auto 5, it takes like what, 10 hours to get all three powering members or something like that, right?
Yeah, even Grand Theft Auto though was a little more forgivable, like because I think you open with a shootout. One of the positives of the era we live in, and this availability of not only big budget games but indie games, is I think we're getting a nice refocus on level design and real playability. There was such desire to be movies for so many years in the video game industry, and I think we're finally getting past it.
Yeah, because you can kind of see that in Doom's evolution too, especially with like Doom 3. As the Doom games kind of went on and on, the developers kind of looked at it and tried to say, well, how can we make this more complex? How can we make this better? While also not sometimes realizing that one of the best Dooms is just the first Doom, and that's just like a really simple game. Rockstar often tries to emulate movies in many ways, and even Naughty Dog too. I think that's kind of their bread and butter, but they often forget how the gameplay should feel and work, and how the player should be feeling like moment to moment.
It's really funny you specifically said Naughty Dog, because this is a real experience I had. I finished Doom 2016, and I'm looking to go on to my next. I usually like to play like a fighting game and an adventure game at the same time. It's just the two genres I usually play. And I'm looking for my next adventure game, so I start Uncharted 4, and I think I played for maybe 2 hours before I was just so bored by how slow it was compared to what I just went through in Doom.
Yeah, I remember when somebody said that Uncharted is more fun to watch than play because the Uncharted combat is still kind of miserable to this day.
And also Nathan Drake, like 10 times the murderer that the Doomslayer is, just slaughtering people constantly.
Well, yeah, demons aren't people.
Yeah. I think there's even, like, body count wise, though, I think Nathan Drake might have beat him. I'm not sure. That was like the first. I remember playing Uncharted for the first time. I got to it late, and I was like, "Oh, cool, an Indiana Jones game." And I'm like, "Indiana Jones never murdered this many people."
Well, even if he did, they were Nazis.
Yeah, that's true too. But he always like, even in like the good Indiana Jones games, I always felt like I was punching guys more than anything else.
I also think like where Doom, you can kind of see the Doom impact of Doom too, with how a lot of these guys that were programming Doom went on to become rock stars in their era and try to make their own studios. Though most of them failed for tons and tons of reasons, because a lot of these programs kept trying to push the boundary of cutting edge technology and infinitely got delayed because of that.
Even Doom gets delayed because of that, and it's an interesting thing where it's just like film. You got to balance what your audience wants with how much innovation you're going to put in and how much time and money that's going to take. Kojima learned that the hard way. But it's true. It's we're all missing that final part of Metal Gear Solid 5 because Kojima wouldn't say no to innovation when maybe he could have. We wouldn't have the game we have, so who knows?
Well, people have said no to Kojima before. Like, I remember with Metal Gear Solid 3, he wanted that, like a 12-hour in-time, real-time battle, sniper battle. And, like, somebody had to tell him no on that, and I'm sure he was upset about that a bit. But, like, with the Doom, you never really had that contention of, like, trying to do something very realistic like that. It was always, like, trying to make things graphically complex and graphically innovative. And not so much in the gameplay, because you kind of see, like, they do change it a bit from time to time, but throughout of them, there's generally the same thread of, like, here's how the guns work. You can have unlimited guns. except in Doom 3 where you have a limited inventory.
I also think that even just the premise of Doom is really influential. Establishing demons as a villain for video games is pretty big. There's just a ton of games that then kind of follow that model. One thing we didn't talk about that's also a huge influence is there were a ton of successful games that were published on the Doom engine. Heretic comes to mind. It was just Doom was innovative in essentially every way that a video game can be. Story, design, level design, gameplay. It embodied a couple of years of video games on its own, which I think is part of the reason why all those expansions still can pop up to this day. We've had an expansion for Doom 64 in 2020, and that's nuts.
Yeah, like even with Doom 3, like, most of the Call of Duty engine was built off of that engine. And like the kind of, I guess, open sourceness of Doom has lended it to a big modding community that still to this day finds new and interesting ways to mod that game.
Yeah, definitely one of the biggest influences and still an incredibly successful franchise today. I think that pretty much brings us to the end of this show. As always, want to remind you, support your local businesses, especially these days. Check out toystoreguide.com to find a lot of those toy stores, comic shops around that really need your support. Thankfully, for a lot of us, things are starting to open up a little bit, but still a lot of restrictions and still a lot of money to be made for those stores. If you want to support us, be sure to check us out on all social media. Well, most social media, right? Not all of it. That'd be impossible. We don't have a TikTok. We did.
For a little bit, yeah, but TikTok's kind of a bad app.
Yeah, read up on that. That's something I can encourage you to do, too. Read up on how bad TikTok is for you and the world. But like I said, type Dissecting Fiction into Google. You're going to find us. If you liked what you heard today, like, share, give us a 5-star rating. You know all this stuff. I don't have to tell you. I hate when people say smash that like button or subscribe. Just tap it with your remote or your mouse. Well, I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Kutlick.
And thanks for listening.